At 9:38 in the morning on July 25, 1944, the sky over a rectangle of Norman farmland west of St. Lo, 6,000 yards wide and roughly 2,200 yards deep, began to fill with engines. 600 American fighter bombers came in first, working a strip 300 yards deep along the St. Lo to Perrier's Road. An hour later, the heavy bombers arrived. Fishermen on the Channel coast, a dozen miles north, heard the rumble as a single low note that would not stop. In the village church towers around Marigny and La Chapelle-en-Juget, the bells trembled on their ropes from the concussion. Civilians in the lanes looked up and saw what survivors would later call a moving ceiling, an unbroken procession of aircraft stretching from horizon to horizon. For nearly 2 hours, the bombs fell. Roughly 3,000 Allied aircraft of the United States 8th Air Force and the 9th Air Force delivered between 3,300 and 4,000 tons of high explosive and napalm into a target box barely a mile wide. Cattle were thrown into trees. Stone farmhouses were pounded into chalk dust. German soldiers buried in foxholes were lifted from the earth and slammed back down again. When the last formation banked away, the rectangle was a moonscape of overlapping craters, and inside it lay the broken pieces of one of the most famous armored divisions in the German army. The bombing was the opening of an operation the Americans called Cobra. Within 72 hours, it would not be a tactical success. It would be a rupture in the entire German defense of France. And inside that rupture, something far more important than a single division would die. The command system that had carried the German army from Warsaw to Paris to the gates of Moscow, the system that had taught the world the meaning of the word blitzkrieg, would suffer a wound from which it would never recover. The thing being killed that summer was not a regiment or a division or even an army. It was a way of thinking. It was the German army's ability to see a battlefield, understand what it was seeing, decide what to do, and act on that decision faster than its enemy could do the same. For nearly a century, since the time of Helmuth von Moltke the Elder in the 1860s, the Prussian and then German General Staff had treated speed of decision as the highest military virtue. They had built an entire culture around it. They called it Auftragstaktik, mission-type orders, and it meant that a colonel given an objective and a deadline was expected to find his own way there, without waiting for permission, without checking back to higher headquarters, without fearing that he would be punished for using his judgment. In 1940, with 7 panzer divisions racing through the Ardennes forest, that culture had broken France in 6 weeks. In 1941, it had carried German tanks to within sight of the Kremlin. By the summer of 1944, in the hedgerows of Normandy, that culture would be the patient on the operating table, and the Americans, almost without realizing it, would be the surgeons. To understand what was destroyed, you have to understand what it was. The German command philosophy had been refined over generations. It was studied in officer schools as a near-religious tradition. A junior officer was trained to operate 2 levels above his actual rank. A lieutenant could be expected to take command of a battalion. A captain could be expected to handle a regiment in a crisis. The whole tradition went back, in its modern form, to Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, the chief of the Prussian General Staff in the wars of German unification in the 1860s and 1870s, who had famously written that no operational plan could survive contact with the main body of the enemy. From that observation, Moltke had drawn a radical conclusion. If plans could not survive contact, then the men who carried out the plans had to be trusted to alter them on their own authority, in the moment, on the ground, where the friction of war was actually happening. Headquarters could provide the intent and the resources. The execution belonged to the man at the front. After the catastrophe of the First World War, that tradition had been preserved by General Hans von Seeckt, the commander of the small 100,000-man Reichswehr that the Treaty of Versailles permitted Germany to keep. Seeckt's army was tiny, but it was an army of cadres, an army in which every officer was schooled in operations as much as in tactics, against the day when the prohibitions would lapse. When Hitler began the rearmament that would expand the Reichswehr into the Wehrmacht of 1939, the new mass army inherited Seeckt's professional corps. The army that crossed into Poland in September of 1939 had institutionalized initiative the way other armies institutionalized drill. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's plan for the Western Campaign in 1940, the famous Sichelschnitt or sickle cut through the Ardennes, only worked because Heinz Guderian, leading the Panzer spearhead, repeatedly disobeyed halt orders from higher headquarters in order to keep moving. He crossed the Meuse River at Sedan on May 13, 1940, roughly 75 to 80 hours after the campaign opened, and reached the English Channel at Abbeville on May 20, only 10 days later. The British and French command systems, slower, more centralized, more dependent on telephone lines and written orders, simply could not keep up. By the time General Maurice Gamelin in Paris understood what was happening, Guderian was already 2 decisions ahead of him. That was the army the Allies thought they were facing in Normandy in the summer of 1944. They knew its reputation. They had felt its sting in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy. They had seen what a panzer division could do when it was unleashed. What they did not yet realize, what nobody outside the highest circles of the German command realized, was that the army of 1944 was a hollow imitation of the army of 1940. The bodies still wore the uniform. The boots still marched. The artillery still fired. But the mind, the central nervous system that had given the German army its lethal speed of thought, had been progressively poisoned, and the poison had a name. The name was Adolf Hitler. The strategic context of June 1944 was already grim for Germany. On June 6, the Allies had landed in Normandy. On June 22, the Soviets had launched Operation Bagration in Belorussia, a strategic offensive that within 6 weeks would destroy 28 of 34 divisions of Army Group Center and inflict roughly 450,000 German casualties, the largest defeat in German military history. On July 20, 1944, a Wehrmacht colonel named Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a briefcase containing a bomb under a conference table at the Wolfslair headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler survived. In the broader Gestapo dragnet that followed, roughly 5,000 people were arrested. Around 200 plotters were directly executed for the conspiracy itself, and Hitler's pre-existing distrust of his own generals hardened into operational paranoia. From that day forward, the Führerbefehl system, the requirement that the dictator personally authorize any major redeployment or retreat, became absolute. A regimental commander on the Cotentin Peninsula could no longer pull his men back 5 miles to a better defensive position without permission filtering down from a bunker 800 miles away in East Prussia. The general staff that had once been trained to think 2 levels up was now forbidden to think 1 level down. The poisoning had been gradual. Hitler had begun to interfere directly with operational decisions during the Russian winter of 1941 and 1942, when his halt order in front of Moscow had been credited, fairly or not, with stabilizing the front. From that moment forward, he had increasingly believed that his iron will was the only thing keeping the army from collapsing. Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch was forced into retirement in December 1941, with Hitler personally taking the title of Commander-in-Chief of the Army. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock was relieved. Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb was dismissed. Heinz Guderian himself was dismissed in December 1941 for ordering a tactical withdrawal. General Oberst Erich Hopner was cashiered and stripped of his pension for the same offense. The pattern, repeated through the Stalingrad disaster of 1942 and 1943, taught the German officer corps a lesson that hollowed out everything Moltke and Secht had built. Initiative, the lesson said, would not save you. Obedience to the Führer's orders, however absurd, might. After the July 20 plot, that hollowing became formal. Subordinates who had once been encouraged to alter plans on their own authority now waited, sometimes for whole days, for confirmations from Berlin that arrived too late to matter or did not arrive at all. The current state of the German army in the West reflected this paralysis. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's command, OB West, had been responsible for the defense of France since 1942. Rundstedt himself, by the summer of 1944, was a 68-year-old man who had once told Allied interrogators that his standing orders from the Führer left him only the authority to change the guard at his front door. He was not exaggerating by much. When the Allies asked him after the war what he would have done in the days after the Normandy landings if he had been given freedom of action, his answer was famous. "Make peace, you fools," he said. "Make peace." Inside this strangled command system, the daily life of the German soldier in Normandy carried on with a fatalistic rhythm. In the Bocage country, infantrymen of divisions like the 353rd and Panzer Grenadiers of the 17th SS dug deep into the earthen banks of the small fields, ate their rations of black bread and ersatz coffee, and waited. Maintenance crews of Panzer Lehr Division, the most heavily equipped armoured division in the German order of battle, pulled the tracks off Panther tanks and Panzer IV medium tanks and crawled underneath to grease the road wheels. Signallers laid telephone cable in the ditches because they had been told that radio traffic was being intercepted. Officers wrote letters home that had to pass military censors. Cooks prepared midday meals of potato soup. Junior officers, the lieutenants and captains who in 1940 would have been encouraged to think for themselves, now consulted, typed orders from Corps headquarters that specified almost everything, down to which crossroads to defend and how many rounds of ammunition to expend per day. The soul of the army had become a clerk. July 25th, 1944, began like any other day in that hot, wet Norman summer. The forward command post of Panzer Lehr Division sat in a small village in the bombing rectangle, surrounded by the camouflaged tanks and half-tracks of the division. Its commander, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, had served as Erwin Rommel's chief of staff in the desert, had survived the long retreat from El Alamein, had been promised by his superiors that his division was the finest armoured formation on the Western Front. He had roughly 2,200 combat troops in his forward positions that morning, 12 operational Panzer IV medium tanks, and 16 operational Panther tanks. Another 30 or so vehicles were in the divisional repair shops. The previous afternoon, July 24, an aborted Allied bombing attempt had caused him to move some of his reserves forward into ground the Americans had vacated. He did not know it, but he had moved them directly into the heart of the rectangle the bombers were coming back to hit. When the heavy bombers struck, 843 of 900, 17 Boeing, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and 647 of 664, consolidated B-24, liberators released their bombs onto the rectangle. Bayerlein, in his post-war interrogations by the United States Army Historical Division, described what happened next. The bombers, he said, came as if on a conveyor belt. Bomb carpets were laid back and forth. Artillery positions were wiped out. Tanks were overturned and buried. All signal communications were cut. No command was possible. The shock effect on his troops, he said, was indescribable. Several of his men went mad and rushed around in the open until they were cut down by splinters. By midday, his front lines looked like a landscape of the moon, and at least 70% of his personnel were out of action, dead, wounded, crazed, or numb. He would not learn until much later that the bombing had also killed Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the commander of the United States Army Ground Forces, who had been visiting a forward observation post and had been killed in his foxhole by a short bomb. McNair would be the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre of operations. What happened next was not in any German manual. American infantrymen of the 9th, 4th, and 30th Divisions began moving forward through the moonscape. By the second day of the operation, July 26, Lieutenant General Joseph Lawton Collins, commanding the 7th Corps, had committed his armour. Combat Command B of the 3rd Armoured Division and the 2nd Armoured Division pushed through the gap and gained 7 miles for the loss of 3 tanks. By July 28, Combat Command B of the 4th Armoured Division had taken the town of Coutances. American tanks crossed within yards of Bayerlein's command post in a small village near Notre-Dame-de-Senlis without realizing how close they had come to capturing the divisional commander. Bayerlein, with no contact to his regiments, with his radios destroyed and his messengers either dead or lost in the chaos, sent his report by July 27 to 7th Army headquarters under General Paul Hauser. Panzer Lehr, he said, was endgültig vernichtet, finally annihilated. The message went up the chain to Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge at Army Group B. By the morning of July 31, Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps had reached the town of Avranches at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. The door to Brittany and to the open country of central France stood wide open. On August 1, 1944, Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army was activated, and over the next 72 hours, 7 American divisions poured across a single intact bridge at Pontaubault. The breakout had become a rupture. The chaos inside the German command system in those days was not a matter of individual cowardice or incompetence. The men in the German chain of command were, on the whole, professionals of long experience. The chaos was structural, Every important decision had to be referred upward, often through multiple layers, and every important order had to come back down through those same layers. Allied air superiority had cut most of the telephone landlines. Radio traffic that did go out was being read at Bletchley Park in England, often within hours of transmission, and the resulting intelligence was being delivered to American and British Army Group headquarters by special liaison teams whose existence was so secret that most of the men they served did not know how the information reached them. The system that the Allies had built, painstakingly over years, was a continuous loop of observation, decision, and action that ran in hours. The system the Germans were trying to operate ran, on a good day, in days. By the time a German order to redeploy a division reached a regimental commander, the situation it was meant to address had already changed twice. Specific failures piled up in the records. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, ordered north from the Toulouse region of southern France immediately after the Normandy landings, took roughly 17 days to reach the front. The journey by rail should have taken 3 or 4 days. Saboteurs of the French resistance, working with British Special Operations executive officers, had drained gearbox oil and replaced it with abrasive grease, had blown up rail viaducts, had ambushed road columns, had made every kilometre a separate battle. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, when finally released to the Western Front from its refit in Belgium, took the better part of a week to reach the Normandy fighting, slowed at every stage by Allied fighter bombers that turned daylight movement into a hazard. The 116th Panzer Division, ordered to participate in the largest German counterattack of the campaign, never even concentrated for the operation because its commander, Lieutenant General Gerhard Graf von Schwerin, was so pessimistic about its chances that he simply did not order his tank units forward. He was relieved of command, but the attack had already failed. That counterattack, code-named Lüttich, was Hitler's personal answer to the Cobra breakout. On August 2, 1944, against the unanimous advice of the senior commanders in the West, he demanded that 8 panzer divisions drive west toward Avranches in order to cut off Patton's spearheads in Brittany from the rest of the Allied army. Kluge could assemble only 4. The directive itself was decrypted at Bletchley Park within hours of being transmitted. Through the afternoon and evening of August 6, the codebreakers fed Bradley a steady stream of supporting orders. Between 7 in the evening and midnight on August 6 and 7, decrypts confirmed which German Air Corps would provide fighter cover, which SS Panzer Division would lead the attack on Mortain itself, and that the attack would jump off with elements of 5 panzer divisions from the area of Saudeval and Mortain. The attack went in around midnight, and at first, in the dark and the fog, it made progress. Mortain itself was overrun. The town of St. Barthélemy fell. But Bradley had already reinforced the 30th Infantry Division on the high ground east of Mortain. When the morning fog burned off around noon on August 7th, the rocket-firing Hawker Typhoons of the Royal Air Force, 2nd Tactical Air Force, and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the United States, 9th Tactical Air Force fell on the German columns in the open. Between 100 and 150 German tanks and assault guns were destroyed in a few hours, more than half the armour committed to the attack. A surrounded battalion of the 120th Infantry, the lost battalion of Hill 314, held its ground for 4 days. Mortain shattered the last German offensive in the west, and worse, it shoved the 7th Army even further forward into a sack the Allies were already preparing to close. The closing of that sack would become known to history as the Falaise Pocket. While the German armour was burning at Mortain, Patton's Third Army was driving east at a pace that astonished even the Americans. By August 8, Le Mans had fallen. By August 12, Major General Wade Hayslip's 15th Corps, including the French 2nd Armoured Division under General Philippe Leclerc, had reached the town of Argentan, just 30 miles south of where the British and Canadians and Poles were grinding south from Caen. Inside the narrowing pocket between the two pincers were elements of 21 German divisions, the bulk of 2 German armies. Field Marshal Kluge spent the night of August 14 and 15 incommunicado after his radio truck was disabled by Allied aircraft. Hitler, hearing of the gap in communications, became convinced that Kluge was attempting to negotiate a surrender to Patton. There is no evidence that Kluge ever made any such attempt, but on August 17, Hitler relieved him. On August 19, Kluge swallowed cyanide on the road from Paris toward Metz, near Verdun, leaving behind a letter that begged Hitler to end the war. His replacement was Field Marshal Walther Model, known throughout the Wehrmacht as the Führer's fireman, the man Hitler sent to hopeless fronts. Model arrived at Army Group B headquarters on August 17 and immediately confirmed the withdrawal Kluge had been trying to organize. It was already too late. On August 19, the 1st Polish Armored Division of General Stanisław Maciek linked up with the United States 90th Infantry Division of Major General Raymond McLean at the village of Chambois. The next day, the Poles seized Hill 262 on the Mont-Ormel Ridge, called the Makjuga or the Mace because of its shape on the map, and held it for 3 days against repeated German breakout attempts. On August 21, tanks of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division linked up with the Poles at Coudhard, and the pocket was sealed. Inside it lay between 10,000 and 15,000 German dead. 40,000 to 50,000 more were taken prisoner. Somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 had escaped, most of them without their weapons, their vehicles, or their equipment. The 7th Army had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. 2 days after the gap was sealed, Dwight Eisenhower walked through the pocket on foot. He wrote later that the battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas, that 48 hours after the closing of the gap, he was conducted through it on foot to encounter scenes that could be described only by Dante. He wrote that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The narrow crossings of the River Dives at St. Lambert and the Gué de Moissy ford were choked with corpses of men and horses because the German army of 1944 still moved most of its infantry, artillery and supply wagons by horse. Pilots of the 9th and 19th Tactical Air Commands reported that the stench of the pocket was perceptible at altitudes of several hundred feet. By the end of August, virtually all surviving German forces in France had been driven back to or across the River Seine. Roughly 40 German divisions had been destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. According to the rigorous casualty research of the Swedish historian Niklas Zetterling, total German losses on the Western Front during the summer of 1944, including those incurred in southern France during Operation Dragoon, came to roughly 289,000 men. Equipment losses in Normandy alone reached more than 1,500 tanks and assault guns, with cumulative German armour losses in the West climbing well past 2,000 vehicles by the time the front stabilized at the German border. Uncounted thousands of trucks and horse-drawn wagons were abandoned for lack of fuel. The Eisenhower headquarters intelligence summary in late August wrote that the enemy had had it. Bradley told his staff that Germany would be defeated in 1944. The collapse was so complete that the limiting factor on the Allied advance was no longer enemy resistance. It was Allied logistics, specifically gasoline, and the fact that the great port of Antwerp, captured intact on September 4, could not be opened to shipping until the Scheldt estuary was cleared in late November. What had happened was not really, at the deepest level, a story of bombs and shells. It was a story of two command systems colliding and one of them disintegrating from the inside. The American system that produced Cobra and the Breakout was not, on paper, an obvious model of military elegance. The United States Army of 1944 was a young, mass, mobilized force, the great majority of whose officers and men had been civilians 5 years earlier. Its tactical doctrine was less polished than the German. Its equipment, in some specific categories, was less impressive. The Sherman medium tank, in its early variants, was outmatched in armor and gunpowder by the Panther. The American infantry rifleman, on average, was probably less skilled in small unit fieldcraft than his German counterpart. Yet the American system possessed three things that, taken together, allowed it to operate inside the German decision cycle. First, the Americans could rebuild the very shape of their armored formations in hours. The American Light Armored Division, introduced in the 1943 reorganization, was built around three task-organized headquarters called Combat Command A, Combat Command B, and Combat Command Reserve. Tank battalions, armored infantry battalions, armored field artillery, tank destroyers, engineers, and reconnaissance could be cross-attached to any of the three commands as the situation required. A division commander could rebuild his order of battle in hours. The German Panzer Division, by contrast, had a rigid structure of permanent regiments and battalions that did not easily reshuffle. When circumstances changed faster than the standing organization could adapt, the German formation lost time. The American formation did not. Second, the Americans had married their tactical air power to their ground maneuver in a way no other army had managed. Major General Otto Wayland's 19th Tactical Air Command was the Air Force partner of Patton's Third Army, and the two headquarters were physically located next to one another. Air liaison officers, 3 times the standard manning by Patton's order, rode in the lead tanks of advancing armored columns. Each American division had 10 to 14 tanks fitted with very high-frequency radios, capable of speaking directly to fighter bombers orbiting overhead. Standard practice, called armored column cover, kept 4 to 8 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts above the lead element at all times. The pilots flew with overlay maps strapped to their thighs because the bomb line moved hourly. They had standing orders not to destroy intact bridges because Patton wanted them for his advance. In August and September of 1944 alone, the 19th Tactical Air Command flew more than 22,000 combat sorties. The German army, by contrast, operated under skies that the Luftwaffe had effectively conceded to the enemy. By August 1944, daylight movement on a French main road, in clear weather, was a death sentence. Third, the Americans were reading the German mind. The work of the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, transmitted through the Special Liaison Unit system to the headquarters of Bradley, Hodges, and Patton, allowed the Americans to read large portions of German operational radio traffic, often within hours of transmission. Before Operation Lüttich at Morton, the relevant German orders had been decrypted in time for Bradley to position a fresh division precisely on the route of the German attack. Throughout the summer, Allied commanders frequently knew the German order of battle, the German intentions, and the German worries better than many German commanders themselves did, because their information travelled faster and more reliably than the Germans did. Put these 3 things together, and you had a functioning loop of observation, decision, and action that ran continuously, in hours, and sometimes in minutes, from the front-line scout in his armoured car back to the Army Group headquarters, and then forward again to the cockpit of the fighter bomber and the turret of the tank. The German loop, by contrast, ran upward through Corps headquarters, Army headquarters, OB West, the Armed Forces High Command, and finally to a dictator in East Prussia who would not delegate. By the time it ran back down again, the situation had moved on without it. This is the underlying mechanism that was later named, by an American Air Force colonel named John Boyd, the OODA loop. Boyd, born in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1927, had flown F-86 Sabre fighters in Korea in 1953, had taught fighter combat tactics at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, and had become, in the 1970s and 1980s, the most original American military theorist of his generation. Boyd's central concept was that combat at every level, from a dogfight between 2 pilots to a campaign between 2 armies, was a contest of who could complete the cycle of observation, orientation, decision, and action faster. The side that consistently moved through that cycle more quickly would, in his words, generate uncertainty, confusion, disorder, panic, and chaos in its opponent. The opponent's cohesion would shatter, paralysis would set in, collapse would follow. Boyd never published a book. He briefed, year after year, an evolving slide deck called Patterns of Conflict, the final version of which he gave in December of 1986. Among his foundational case studies was the German Blitzkrieg of 1940 against France, which he held up as the perfect example of getting inside an enemy's decision cycle. He also discussed, less explicitly but unmistakably, the way the German army's own command culture had been destroyed under Hitler, the way the original Auftragstaktik had been replaced by what Boyd's contemporaries called Befehlstaktik, command by direct order. The men who actually broke the German army in France in 1944 did not use Boyd's vocabulary. They spoke of tempo, of follow-through, of exploitation, of armoured column cover, but they were doing what Boyd would later describe. It is important to be honest about the parallels in history. The principle that the OODA framework names is not a peculiarly American idea, nor is it a peculiarly modern one. The very army that disintegrated in Normandy had once been its supreme practitioner. In May of 1940, the French and British command systems, slow, centralized, dependent on the telephone and the motorcycle dispatch rider, had been broken in 8 days by Guderian's Panzer Corps. The French 55th and 71st Infantry Divisions had collapsed at the so-called Panic of Bulsen, partly because their commanders were located far to the rear and lacked. As the historian Karl-Heinz Frieser argues in the Blitzkrieg legend, anything close to a real-time picture of the battle. Their information was hours old. Guderian's information was minutes old. The French could not catch up. In June of 1944, in Belorussia, the Soviet Operation Bagration broke the German Army Group Center by exactly the same kind of tempo dominance, helped in equal measure by the same Hitler micromanagement that would soon destroy the Westia. The Soviets concentrated roughly 1.7 million combat troops, more than 4,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and approximately 6,000 aircraft against an army group center that had been progressively stripped to reinforce other sectors. Through an elaborate program of deception, what the Soviets called Maskirovka, the German Armed Forces High Command had been convinced that the main blow would fall further south, in northern Ukraine. By the time the Soviet offensive opened on June 22, 3 years to the day after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Army Group Center had been thinned of 1/3 of its artillery, half of its tank destroyers, and nearly 9 in every 10 of its tanks. The same Hitler decree forbidding tactical withdrawal that would soon doom the Westia trapped Army Group Center's divisions in fortified strongpoints called Feste at Vitebsk, Bobruisk, and Mogilev, where they were surrounded and destroyed in detail. Within 5 weeks, Soviet armies advanced up to 350 miles. 28 of 34 German divisions had been annihilated. The OODA loop, if that is what we wish to call it, is impartial. It serves whoever has tempo, communication, decentralization, and good intelligence. In 1940, those things had been German. By 1944, they were no longer. The shock of the summer of 1944 ran through the German officer corps for the rest of the war. There would be no recovery of the pre-war command culture. There would only be a series of doomed improvisations. In December 1944, in a final act of will, Hitler ordered the Ardennes counteroffensive. And for 1 week, between December 16 and December 22, in heavy fog that grounded Allied air, with strict radio silence that denied Bletchley its harvest of decrypts, the German army briefly recovered its old tempo. Roughly 30 German divisions, with a leading wave of around 200,000 men supported by approximately 1,000 tanks and assault guns, struck a thinly held American front in the Ardennes forest. Approximately 7,000 men of the Green American 106th Infantry Division surrendered at the Schnee Eifel, the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theatre. The town of Bastogne, a road junction in southern Belgium, was encircled with the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armoured Division Combat Command B inside. But even in this brief revival, the German army was no longer the army of 1940. On December 22, when a German negotiating party demanded the surrender of Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st, gave the famous reply that consisted, in formal writing, of a single word: nuts. Colonel Joseph Harper, who delivered the typed reply to the Germans, told them when they asked what it meant that, in plain English, it meant, go to hell. On December 19, in the famous Council of War at Verdun, when Eisenhower asked Patton how soon he could disengage Third Army from operations facing east and attack north into the German flank, Patton said, 3 divisions in 48 hours, he delivered. By the early hours of December 22, 3 divisions of Third Army had pivoted 90 degrees and were attacking north over icy roads. On December 23, the weather cleared and the 9th and 19th Tactical Air Commands returned to the battlefield. On December 26, at 4:50 in the afternoon, a Sherman tank of Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, named Cobra King, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, made contact with paratroopers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion just outside Bastogne. The siege was broken. The German offensive had run out of fuel, run out of room, and run out of time, exactly as the Falaise breakout had 4 months earlier, and for the same reason. Once the Allies recovered their tempo, the Germans had no answer. By early 1945, the institutional rot was complete. A staff officer at OB West would write later that orders coming down from the Führer headquarters now bore no recognizable relationship to the situation on the ground. The army that had once trained its lieutenants to think like generals was now an army whose generals were forbidden to think at all. Field Marshal Walter Model dissolved his Army Group B in the Ruhr Pocket rather than surrender it. 4 days later, on April 21, 1945, he walked into a wood between Duisburg and Ratingen and shot himself with his service pistol. Roughly 317,000 of his men had laid down their arms in the previous fortnight. The killer of the German command system, in the end, was not a single Allied weapon or a single Allied general. It was the cumulative failure to do the one thing the German army had once done better than anyone else in the world, which was to think faster than the enemy. The aftermath of the Normandy breakout would shape the way Western armies thought about war for the next half-century. After the war, the United States Army Historical Division, with the cooperation of the former chief of the German General Staff Franz Halder, gathered hundreds of senior German officers in captivity and asked them to write down what they had seen. The resulting Foreign Military Studies collection, several thousand manuscripts in all, became one of the foundational documents of post-war military scholarship. Bayerlein, Manteuffel, and many other surviving commanders contributed accounts of the campaigns they had fought. Heinz Guderian published his memoirs in 1951 under the title Erinnerungen eines Soldaten, later translated into English as Panzer Leader. Erich von Manstein published his own in 1955 under the title Verloren Siege, Lost Victories. These writings, taken together, became required reading in the American and West German officer corps. They shaped the great doctrinal renewal that came in the United States Army in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the doctrine called Air-Land Battle, codified in the August 1982 edition of Field Manual 100-5 Operations, drafted by a team led by Lieutenant Colonels Huber Was de Chege and Donald Holder under the Training and Doctrine Command General Don Starry. The 4 tenets of Air-Land Battle were initiative, agility, depth, and synchronization. The doctrine emphasized fighting deep against enemy second echelons, integrating Army and Air Force assets across close, deep, and rear battle spaces, and pushing decision authority down to the lowest competent level. In 1989, the United States Marine Corps, under Commandant General Alfred Gray, published Fleet Marine Force Manual 1, Warfighting, which embraced maneuver warfare even more explicitly. Both documents drew, in different ways, on the painful study of how the Wehrmacht had once destroyed everything in its path and then been destroyed in turn. The Marine Corps text bore the more direct intellectual fingerprint of John Boyd and the broader military reform movement. The Army's Air-Land Battle, while it shared that same general lineage, took its more immediate inspiration from the Soviet operational tradition and the staff work of the Training and Doctrine Command itself. Today, in current United States Army doctrine, the concept appears under the name Mission Command, defined in Army Doctrine Publication 6-0, published in 2019. As the Army's approach to command and control that empowers subordinate decision-making and decentralized execution, the publication explicitly traces its lineage back to the German Auftragstaktik tradition. The summer breakout of 1944, from Cobra to Avranches to Falaise, taught at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth and at the School of Advanced Military Studies, is the foundational American case study of that lineage. It is taught not to celebrate American superiority, but to remind every new generation of officers of a hard institutional lesson. Centralization is a slow poison. Initiative pushed downward beats brilliance hoarded at the top. The side that completes its decision cycle first will, on most days, finish the battle. What is striking, when you stand back from the records, is how unromantic the lesson is. The German army was not defeated in Normandy by a better tank, although the Sherman improved during the campaign. It was not defeated by braver soldiers, because German soldiers fought, on the whole, as bravely as anyone. It was not defeated by superior generalship in the narrow sense, because Bradley, Patton, and Collins were able men but not geniuses on the order of a Manstein or a Guderian. It was defeated by a system. It was defeated by the simple, grinding, daily fact that information flowed faster across the American front, that decisions traveled shorter distances, that subordinates were trusted to act, that air and ground spoke directly to one another, that intelligence collected at midnight was acted on by dawn. Multiplied across thousands of small encounters, this systemic advantage became overwhelming. When a German company commander received an order 3 days after the situation it was meant to address had passed, he was not failing personally. He was experiencing the death, in slow motion, of his army's central nervous system. There is a tendency, in popular memory, to picture the collapse of 1944 as a wave of overwhelming American material. There were certainly more American shells, more American gallons of gasoline, more American replacement vehicles, but material alone does not explain Falaise. Material alone does not explain why a single American tank battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams could break through a German line at Assenois and reach Bastogne, while a German infantry corps could not coordinate its 3 subordinate divisions to stop him. The explanation lies in the difference between an army that had taught its junior officers to take initiative and an army that had spent 5 years progressively forbidding them to. By the autumn of 1944, the gap between the two had become unbridgeable. And that gap is the real legacy of the campaign. The towns of the Norman bocage have been rebuilt. The rusted hulks of the panzers in the Falaise sunken roads have long since been melted down for scrap. The cemeteries, German at La Cambre, American at Colleville-sur-Mer, Polish at Urville-Langannery, hold their dead with quiet dignity. The American War Cemetery above Omaha Beach receives more than 1 million visitors a year, but the practical lesson lives most actively not in the museums, and not on the battlefield walking tours. It lives in the doctrine manuals on the shelves of staff colleges, from West Point to Quantico to Sandhurst to Hamburg, where every new class of officers is taught, in one form or another, what the summer of 1944 made unmistakable. The side that observes, orients, decides, and acts faster than its opponent will, in the end, prevail, and any system that strangles its own ability to do so is preparing its own defeat. The men who lived through that summer have, almost all of them, passed away now. Bayerlein died in 1970, Manteuffel died in 1978, Guderian died in 1954. John Boyd died in 1997 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where Marines placed the globe and anchor insignia of their corps beside his urn at the graveside, the highest posthumous honor they can bestow. The American sergeants and German lieutenants who fought one another in the hedgerows are nearly all gone. What they leave behind is a record, voluminous and detailed and, where the historian is patient, very precisely truthful, of how a great army can lose its mind. The Germans of 1944 were not stupid. They were not cowardly. They were trapped inside a command system that had been designed to free them and had been twisted into something that paralyzed them. They lost not because they failed to fight, but because, by the time their thinking caught up with what they were fighting, the battle had already moved on without them. This is why the breakout from Normandy matters far beyond the specific fields and roads where it happened. It is the clearest demonstration in the 20th century of a principle that long predates any specific army. It is the principle that war is a contest of decisions before it is a contest of weapons, and that the side which can see clearly, think clearly, and act clearly, faster than the other, has already won most of what matters before the first shell is fired. The German soldier of 1944, courageous and skilled, paid in his blood for the slow strangulation of his own command system. The Allied soldier of 1944, less polished and often less experienced, was carried forward by a system that, almost without his awareness, was doing for him the one thing his enemy could no longer do. The story of that summer is not, in the end, a story of glory. It is a story of the cold mathematics of decision and time, and it is the story that, more than any other from the Second World War, determined how the armies that came after would learn to think, to organize, and to fight.